Imagine being abandoned, pregnant, with 4 children clinging to your skirt, homeless, familyless, and carrying the weight of being called a disgrace just for existing. That's what happened to Elara. They didn't just ask her to leave. They pushed her toward a dilapidated cabin in the middle of the unforgiving Arizona desert, a place given to her not so she could live, but to watch her and her shame disappear. But tell me, what does a mother do when the entire world wants to see her fall? What happens when society and her own family have cast her out? Surrender is never an option. She fights, she protects, she becomes a storm. Except Elara wasn't alone. Beneath that forgotten cabin, buried under layers of dust and dark legends, she found no ghosts or curses. She found something living, something starving, and something just as desperate as she was. And what that pregnant widow did next didn't just save her children. It turned the hell she was given into the most unexpected and most fiercely protected paradise in the American desert. Elara tasted the bitter grit of dust and betrayal as her brother-in-law, Jeremiah's wagon, vanished over the ridge. It left a suffocating cloud of ochre dust that took an eternity to settle, coating her and her 4 small children in the filth of their expulsion. She was 7 months pregnant, her body swollen and aching, not just from the child, but from unshed tears in the suffocating, oppressive heat of 1881. They were in some forgotten corner of the Arizona territory, a place where the sun didn't just shine, it punished. "It's the cabin nobody wants, Elara," Jeremiah had shouted, his voice laced with a casual cruelty that needed no justification. He had tossed her last meager bundle of clothes onto the dry, cracked ground, where it landed with a dull, final thud. "It's all you have left. Be grateful I didn't leave you on the trail for the coyotes." The stories. That was the real punishment, the true venom in his actions. He hadn't just given her a ruin, he'd given her a grave. Rumors were whispered in the small settlement they'd been cast out from, stories of a cabin built not on earth, but over the mouth of hell itself. A place that didn't just sit, it waited. They said it devoured its occupants, that prospectors who'd taken shelter there had been found weeks later, not dead, but mad, scratching at their own eyes. They said the nights brought sounds that didn't just freeze the blood, but actively drove men into arms. But Elara, a widow, outcast, and now formally expelled by her late husband's family, had no options left. Her husband, God rest his soul, had been a good man, but his family saw her only as a burden, and this new pregnancy, a final disgrace. Her only choice was to walk. Holding the trembling hand of 3-year-old Sophia, while 10-year-old Matthew, his face pale and grim, tried to carry the heaviest bundle, Elara advanced with her small, terrified caravan toward the structure silhouetted against the bleeding purple dusk. The cabin was old, yes, but it was strangely solid, built of thick stone at its base and heavy, noble woods that had resisted the rot of time as if it stubbornly refused to die. The vegetation, however, had nearly swallowed it, thorny vines climbing the walls like skeletal fingers trying to strangle the life out of it. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was unnatural. Not even the cicadas or the insects sang. It was a dead, waiting silence. The door yielded with a complaining groan that sounded like a pained animal. The smell that rushed out to greet them was the first physical blow. It was a heavy, dense mix of ancient mold, the pungent, eye-watering stench of animal urine, and something else. Something metallic and oxidized, like old, dried blood that had soaked deep into the packed dirt floor. The darkness inside was cooler, but it was not a relief. It was a thick, watchful void, and they had just walked right into it. That first night, as her 4 children slept in a huddled pile on the floor, exhausted by fear, grief, and the long journey, Elara couldn't close her eyes. She sat with her back pressed hard against the splintered wall, her swollen belly an awkward desk for her overwhelming despair. Where would they get water? What would they eat when the small sack of cornmeal ran out? She was a mother. She was supposed to protect them. She had failed. That's when she heard it. It wasn't the creak of the old wood settling. It wasn't the wind in the cracks. It was a low, guttural vibration, a deep resonance that seemed to rise through the soles of her worn boots, coming not from outside, but from directly under the cabin floor. It was a slow, heavy, impossibly large breath that rumbled in the absolute silence. Something massive, something alive was breathing in the cellar, just beneath the thin warped boards that separated her world from the abyss. Elara's heart stopped. The stories weren't just stories. They were living, breathing on top of the nightmare. Terrified, she spent the rest of the night sitting rigidly against the front door, not the cellar door. Her instinct wasn't to fight, but to flee. She held a rusted single-bit hatchet she'd found lying in the corner of the abandoned kitchen, a pathetic, useless weapon against an enemy that lived beneath the earth. Her hands trembled, but she made no sound. Every shadow the moonlight cast through the broken windows seemed to move, but the only real recurring sound was that deep, rhythmic, sleeping breath under her feet. Her fear wasn't for herself, it was for the 4 small hearts that beating in the room with her, and the 5th tiny heart moving restlessly in her womb, all of them depending on her to survive a threat she couldn't even name. The gray, joyless light of dawn brought no relief, only illumination for the filth and abandonment. The sound from below ceased precisely with the sun, as if it, too, had a schedule. But the presence remained. For 2 agonizing days, the family lived as prisoners in the upper half of the cabin, speaking only in terrified whispers. Elara rationed the last of their hardtack and dried cheese, but the hunger in her children's eyes grew as fast as the terror. On the 2nd day, the growl returned even before the sun had fully set, bolder now. This time it was accompanied by a dull, heavy thud, a powerful impact against the underside of the floorboards, as if the thing below knew they were there and was testing the strength of its cage. Little Sophia would burst into silent tears, hiding her face in Elara's skirt every time the floor vibrated with the beast's restless movement. It was Matthew, her eldest, who finally broke the paralysis. He was pale, but his eyes held the firm, desperate gaze of a man forced to grow up too fast. "Mother," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What is down there? We can't live like this. We're starving. We have to know." Elara looked at him. The boy was right. The uncertainty was killing them as surely as any beast. She needed to see. She needed to know what she was praying against. With the heavy hatchet in one hand and a trembling, lit candle in the other, she approached the darkest corner of the kitchen, where a thick wooden trapdoor sat in the floor, secured by a simple, heavy iron latch. The smell emanating from the cracks was almost unbearable, a hot, rank mixture of ammonia and decay. She took a deep breath. The air burning her lungs lifted the latch and opened the door just inches. The hot, foul animal air hit her with the force of a physical fist, making her recoil. She gathered every last scrap of courage she possessed, the courage of pure desperation, and threw the trapdoor open. She held the candle over the black, gaping hole. At first, she saw nothing but packed earth and deep shadows. Then a slow, languid movement. The candle light illuminated what made her choke back a scream, clapping a hand over her own mouth to silence it. It wasn't a demon, it was eyes. 6 pairs of golden eyes, shining like coins in the blackness, staring up at her. It was jaguars, a massive mother jaguar and 2 almost adult cubs, all of them horribly emaciated. Their beautiful spotted fur matted and stuck to their ribs. They were trapped in the blackness of the cellar. She slammed the door shut, throwing her weight on it, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would burst from her chest. Jaguars, the most feared and revered predators of the desert. The cabin wasn't built on hell, it was occupied. The stories were real, but people had mistaken the monster. The true, unadulterated horror. The real test of her fate arrived on the 3rd day, just as the last crumb of bread was gone. Little Sophia, the most vulnerable, began to burn with fever. Her small body, already weakened by hunger, had no fight left. Her skin felt like fire to the touch, and her eyes, normally bright and curious, became glassy and lost. Elara tried to give her water from their near-empty canteen, but the girl could barely swallow. And then, as if destiny itself wanted to rub salt in her wounds, the storm that had been threatening on the horizon for days finally broke. The sky tore open. It wasn't a gentle rain, it was a biblical deluge, a violent downpour that hammered the wooden roof with the fury of 1,000 drums. The wind howled, a living thing, forcing itself through every crack in the cabin, instantly extinguishing her candle and plunging them into a near total darkness, broken only by the fractions of seconds of blinding light from the lightning. The cabin became a trap of water, wind, and cold. Elara was trapped, her world reduced to a single dark, leaking room, her daughter's illness, a burning weight in her arms, and the enraged, starving beasts roaring and slamming against the floor beneath them, now agitated and maddened by the thunder of the storm. It was Sophia's cry that changed everything. As the child whimpered in her feverish delirium, her small, reedy moans of "Mama, it hurts," cut through the noise of the storm. In a moment of calm between two claps of thunder, one of the growls from below changed. It was no longer threatening or angry. It sounded impossibly like a moan of response, a low, pained, guttural sound filled with a suffering that sounded shockingly like empathy. Laura froze, her entire body rigid. Was she delirious too? Was she now imagining sympathy from the beasts that wanted to eat them? There it was again, a sound of distinct anguish from below, directly answering her daughter's pained cry. Desperate, looking at Sophia's fading, shallow breaths, Elara returned to the trap door. She opened it. The mother jaguar looked up at her, its great golden eyes shining in the gloom. There was no aggression in them, just a profound, weary intelligence. It was weak, and it was listening to her child's suffering. Elara made a decision that defied all logic, all reason, and every human instinct for survival. She looked at the feverish, dying form of Sophia, then at the dark, stinking cellar, and she understood. There were two mothers in this cabin, and both of them were fighting desperately for the lives of their young. Ignoring the screams of terror in her own mind, she crawled to her meager supplies. There was nothing left, only the last rock-hard piece of beef jerky she had been saving for Matthew in the bucket, which was now filling with rainwater from a leak in the roof. It was a pathetic offering, but it was all she had. She opened the trapdoor fully. The golden eyes watched her. The growl this time was low, almost an interrogative murmur. With hands trembling so much she could barely tie the knot, she fastened the jerky to a piece of rope and slowly lowered it into the darkness. The cubs stirred, whining with hunger, but the mother let out a short, sharp growl, and they held still. The mother jaguar looked at the meat, then looked at Elara. Elara then lowered the bucket of fresh rainwater. "It's for you," she whispered, her voice broken by her daughter's fever and her own crippling fear. "Please, my children." The mother jaguar dragged herself forward, moving with a painful, agonizing slowness. She didn't lunge for the food. She moved with difficulty, and that's when the candlelight, shielded from the rain, illuminated her flank, and Elara saw the true source of the horror. Her right hind leg was trapped, swollen and black, in the rusted, iron-toothed jaws of an old bear trap. The trap itself was chained to one of the heavy foundation beams. They weren't occupants, they were prisoners, just like her. The cabin's former terrified owner hadn't been devoured by demons. He had likely set the trap for the jaguar, and when he'd realized he'd caught the mother and her cubs, he'd fled in terror of the male's return, leaving them to die slowly and horribly under his own house. Elara felt a wave of nausea, but also a strange, sharp clarity. The enemy wasn't the beast. The enemy was the human cruelty that had left them there. The jaguar looked at her, her breathing shallow from the pain of the gangrenous leg. In that instant, the barrier between species dissolved. They were two mothers, trapped by different kinds of iron, one of rust and steel, the other of Jeremiah's malice and the world's indifference. For a week that felt like a century, the cabin became a strange, shared hospital. The storm raged outside, sealing them from the world. Elara lived in a waking limbo of desperate care. She boiled rags in the rainwater for Sophia's forehead, forcing tiny drops of water between her cracked lips. And every few hours she would lower water, and when she could, small pieces of a rabbit that Matthew, in a burst of desperate courage, managed to snare near the front door. She spoke in a low voice to the jaguar. "Hold on, mother, hold on." The cubs, who had been skeletal, began to fill out, and now watched her with a wary curiosity that had replaced their fear. Sophia's fever finally peaked on the 7th night. The girl stopped crying and fell into a dreadful, unnatural stillness that Elara recognized as the precursor to death. Her body was cold. Despite the blankets, Elara curled over her, weeping in silence, pleading with any god that might be listening. Don't take her. Please, not her. As she wept, she heard the sound from below. Not a growl, but a long, heartbreaking, guttural wail that vibrated from the mother jaguar's chest. It was a sound of pure, shared empathy, a mother grieving with another mother. Elara lifted her head, listening. As if that shared sound had broken something, Sophia coughed, a small, rattling spasm, and then took a deep, shuddering breath. Elara touched her forehead. The fire was gone. The fever had broken. The girl was sleeping, exhausted, but alive. With Sophia safe, wrapped in blankets and breathing peacefully, Elara knew what she had to do. The jaguar had given her some unnameable comfort in the darkness. Now it was her turn. The trap wouldn't open itself, and the gangrene would kill the jaguar for certain. She waited for the storm to subside at dawn. She left Matthew in charge of his siblings with firm instructions. I'm going down. Mother, no, it will kill you, Matthew pleaded, his eyes wide with terror. It won't, Elara said, though her heart was a hammer in her chest. It's waiting. She took the hatchet, not as a weapon, but as a tool, and descended the rickety ladder into the cellar. The darkness was almost total, the smell overwhelming. She lit a candle and set it in a niche. The two cubs retreated to the farthest corner, growling softly. The mother jaguar lay on her side, observing her with a terrifying, intelligent calm. She was exhausted, too weak to attack, or perhaps she understood. Elara approached the trap. It was a brutal piece of iron, its teeth buried deep in the swollen, blackened flesh. She saw the spring mechanism, rusted almost solid by time and damp. She couldn't open it with her hands. She raised the hatchet, not to strike the beast, but the trap. This is going to hurt, she whispered. The jaguar looked at her, then, in a gesture of profound trust or resignation, closed its eyes. Elara struck the spring mechanism with the back of the hatchet. 1, 2, 3 times. The rusted metal shrieked, but didn't give. The cubs growled, agitated by the noise. The mother trembled in agony, but didn't move. Elara struck again with all the force of her body, with the desperation of the last several months, with the rage at Jeremiah, at the world. There was a sickening metallic crack, a crunch of what might have been bone and metal, and the trap's jaws sprang open. The jaguar let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the cabin, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and Elara fell backward, scrambling away, waiting for the killing blow, the swipe of the claw that would end it all. It never came. Elara opened her eyes, which she hadn't realized she'd closed. The jaguar was panting, its freed paw bleeding profusely onto the dirt floor. It stayed immobile for a long second, its chest heaving. Then slowly it turned its great head and began to frantically lick the mangled wound, cleaning the infection and the blood. It didn't look at Elara with fury or even gratitude. It simply began the work of healing. Elara, trembling from head to foot, crawled backward and scrambled up the ladder, sealing the trap door. A silent, impossible pact had been sealed. 3 days later, the cellar was empty. A new, different terror seized Elara. They were gone. She was alone again. But then she saw that in the opposite foundation, a hole had been dug in the loose stone, an exit excavated by the beasts who had finally escaped. She felt a profound relief, but also a strange, sharp loneliness. That night, she slept deeply for the first time. The next morning, Matthew woke her, not with a whisper, but a shout. "Mother, come, quickly!" Elara ran to the door, her heart seizing, expecting Jeremiah or worse. There, on the threshold, perfectly placed, was a large, fresh rabbit. The jaguars hadn't left. They had become her providers. The weeks that followed settled into a routine that defied reality. Elara stopped fearing the night. The darkness was now her ally. She began to fear the day, the moment when their scant provisions of cornmeal would run out. But the pact sealed in the cellar's darkness was real. Every morning or every other, they would find an offering, sometimes a rabbit, other times an armadillo, once even a young javelina. It was fresh meat, meat that Elara cooked over the repaired hearth, filling the cabin with the scent of survival. The blood that marked their doorstep was no longer a sign of terror, but the seal of an unlikely alliance. The children, with the astonishing resilience of youth, adapted first. They stopped speaking in whispers. The fear left their eyes. Matthew saw the mother jaguar first, sitting on a high rock about 50 yards away. She wasn't stalking him. She was simply watching. Her golden eyes blinked slowly in the sun. It was the look of a sentinel, a guardian surveying her territory. And now they were part of it. With the immediate threat of starvation resolved, Elara's spirit, which had been broken, began to mend. But she was pregnant. Time was running out. She couldn't give birth on a dirt floor. She had to make this ruin a home. With a surge of energy born of pure necessity, she began to work. She and Matthew cleaned decades of filth. They used mud from a nearby dry riverbed and old straw to patch the adobe walls. They repaired the roof. They made the cabin a refuge, not against beasts, but against the elements. But the land itself remained their enemy. The ground was hard as stone. The old well she had seen was collapsed, full of debris and the dry bones of small animals. This was their new desperation. The jaguars brought meat, an unthinkable luxury, but they couldn't bring water. The nearest creek, a mile-long, back-breaking trek, was now just a trickle of stagnant brown water, dangerous to drink. Elara began rationing the rainwater she had collected, but she knew it wouldn't last. Sophia, who had been so close to death, seemed to have absorbed some of the place's wild magic. She alone had no fear. "They come at night, Mama," she said one evening, with total naturalness. "They watch over us." Elara believed her. The weeks turned into a month, then two. Elara was now in her 8th month, heavy and moving with difficulty. The lack of clean water had become critical. She boiled the murky creek water, but even so, the children complained of stomach pains. She prayed for rain, but the sky remained a relentless cobalt blue. It was one stifling afternoon when the heat was so oppressive the air itself seemed to vibrate that the mother jaguar appeared, not in the brush, but in the yard in broad daylight. She wasn't carrying food. She walked directly to the back of the cabin, where the stone foundation merged with a small, rocky hill. She stopped and looked at Elara, who was watching from the doorway. The jaguar didn't look at the woods or at Elara. She looked intently at the back wall, where the cabin's masonry met the natural rock of the hill. She let out a low, guttural meow, then did something extraordinary. She began to scratch the wall, not with fury, but with deliberate attention. She clawed at a specific section of loose stone and old mortar that looked like it had been repaired many times. Elara approached slowly, her heart beating with a new kind of curiosity. The beast looked at her over its shoulder, those intelligent golden eyes meeting hers, and then returned to scratching the wall. She meowed again, a demanding sound, then sat back on her haunches, watching. It was an invitation. It was an order. "Matthew," Elara called, her voice trembling. "Bring the hatchet." They examined the spot. The jaguar was right. This part of the wall wasn't solid. It was a man-made false wall. Using the hatchet as a lever and a broken spade they had found, Elara and Matthew began to work, the jaguar observing them like a patient supervisor. The stones and crumbling adobe gave way, revealing a dark, narrow opening behind the kitchen wall. A new smell emerged, not the rank odor of animals or decay, but a clean, cool scent of damp earth and cold stone. And then they heard it, a sound that made Elara drop the spade and clap her hands to her mouth. It was the sound of dripping water, a steady, rhythmic plink, plink, plink in the darkness. Elara lit a candle and pushed it into the opening. Matthew and she peered inside. Behind the false wall was a small, natural grotto, a hollow in the hill stone that the cabin's builders had decided to wall off rather than use. And from deep within the rock, a thin but constant stream of crystal clear, pure water trickled out, dripping into a natural stone basin before disappearing back into the earth. It was a spring, an eye of water, a source of fresh, potable water, protected from the sun and from contamination, bubbling up literally inside her own home. In the absolute aridity of the desert, water wasn't wealth. It was a miracle. It was the one luxury Jeremiah never knew existed. Elara wept, not the tears of despair, but tears of pure, incredulous relief. She knelt and plunged her hands into the small pool. It was cold, so cold it almost hurt, and it tasted of clean stone. She drank the purest, sweetest taste she had ever known, and felt life return to her parched body. She called the children. They ran in, drinking and splashing with animal joy, their laughter echoing in the small grotto. The mother jaguar, her work done, rose with the silent dignity of a queen, turned, and vanished into the brush. The cabin, which had been a tomb, became a fountain of life. Over the next month, as her body grew heavier, Elara and Matthew worked with renewed energy. They channeled the water using hollowed-out branches and stone troughs that Matthew cleverly carved. They diverted the spring's flow, creating a small, permanent stream that ran through the kitchen, where they always had fresh water for drinking and cooking, and then out a hole in the opposite wall. Outside, the transformation was profound. They dug irrigation ditches and terraces. Where only cracked, dead earth had been, there was now dark, fertile mud. They planted their few remaining seeds of corn and beans, seeds they had hoarded as a useless relic. Now, with constant water and the jaguars protecting the garden from deer and pests, the garden exploded. In weeks, vibrant green shoots pushed through the red earth. The children regained their lost weight. Their skin, once gray with malnutrition, glowed. Elara gave birth to her fifth child on a full moon night, alone in her bed, while her children slept. It was a hard, difficult birth, but she wasn't afraid. The sound of the stream running through her kitchen was her companion, a constant reminder that life persisted. But she wasn't completely alone. As she pushed, stifling her cries, she heard a low, resonant purr growl from the front porch. The mother jaguar was lying there, standing guard. A wild midwife, ensuring the mother of her pact was safe. Elara delivered a healthy, strong baby girl and named her Brooke. Life settled into a perfect, impossible balance. The jaguars patrolled the perimeter. Matthew tended the garden. The two jaguar cubs, now imposing and elegant beasts, sometimes played at a distance with the children. A strange version of tag where both sides understood the rules. They were an extended family, an impossible ecosystem where domesticity and wildness coexisted. Elara felt safer in that cabin, surrounded by apex predators, than she ever had in the settlement, surrounded by men like Jeremiah. The locals, the few cowboys who passed on the distant trail, began to notice. They saw the white smoke from her chimney. They saw the impossible, vibrant green of her garden in the peak of the dry season. And more than one claimed to have seen Elara's children playing while golden demons watched over them from the rocks. The stories about the cabin changed. It was no longer built on hell. It was haunted by the jaguar widow, a woman who, they said, had made a pact with the desert itself, who commanded beasts and made water spring from stone. They were right about almost all of it. But Elara knew the peace wouldn't last. She knew the news of the green miracle would eventually reach Jeremiah. The man who had banished her out of spite and greed would not be able to stand the idea that she had not only survived, but was now thriving on the very land he'd discarded. Greed, she had learned, was a stronger, hotter fire than superstitious fear. 6 years passed, 6 years in which Elara's paradise put down deep roots. Matthew, who had arrived as a terrified 10-year-old, was now a tall, quiet 16-year-old, with the wisdom of the desert in his eyes. He had learned the language of the jaguars when they hunted, when they patrolled. Brooke, the child of the spring, was a wild, bright 6-year-old who had never known hunger or fear. Her world was the cabin, the garden, and the jaguars, whom she watched with silent adoration. Then, a severe drought, the worst in a decade, gripped the territory. A neighboring friendly cowboy, Jacinto, brought the news. The main river was dry. Cattle were dying by the dozens. People in the settlement were starving. And Jeremiah's land, Jacinto told her, was a sterile desert. He was broken, a man consumed by rage, blaming the witch at the spring for stealing the rain from the sky. He was gathering other desperate men, promising them the only treasure that mattered: water. Elara was not a fool. The peace she had built was a luxury, and all luxuries are coveted. The cabin became a fortress. Matthew sharpened the hatchet, the same tool that had freed the mother and uncovered the spring. He prepared it for a different purpose. The jaguars sensed it too. The air was thick with threat. The three jaguars, the mother now silvering with age, became an omnipresent guard, lying in broad daylight on the high rocks overlooking the only path. The war, Elara knew, was inevitable. It came at dusk 2 days later. The alarm came from the jaguars, a low, simultaneous growl from three throats, a vibration that shook the ground. "They're here," Matthew said, grabbing the hatchet. It wasn't a small group. It was a mob. Perhaps 15 men, but they looked like skeletons. Men with eyes sunken from thirst, armed with torches, machetes, and old rifles. They were mad with desperation. "The water," they chanted, their voices hoarse. "Kill the witch and take the water." Elara stood on the terrace, Matthew at her side. Jeremiah was at the front, his face a mask of hatred and thirst. "Last chance, Elara," he screamed. "Give us the water or we'll burn you with your demons." At that precise instant, the three jaguars emerged, the mother in front, the two young males flanking the mob. "They're just beasts," Jeremiah shrieked, recognizing his own cowardice. He pointed his rifle not at the cats, but directly at Elara. "Kill the witch, and the demons will vanish." Two men, their eyes glazed, charged. Before Matthew could even lift the hatchet, the air split. One of the young jaguars moved with a speed that defied time. It wasn't a leap. It was a blur of muscle and claw. It met the first man mid-stride. There was no fight, just an impact. A wet, heavy sound, and the man's scream was cut short as he was dragged down. The second man tripped, falling onto his back, staring in pure terror as the other jaguar pounced. The mob broke. Jeremiah, seeing his army dissolve, lifted his rifle toward Elara. She was the source. He fired. The shot was deafening. A violation. The bullet splintered the wooden post inches from Elara's head. That was the final mistake. The threat to Elara broke the mother jaguar's predatory calm. She had been watching, controlling, but the gunshot was a declaration of war against the other mother of the cabin. In the second of silence, as Jeremiah fumbled to reload, she launched. She covered the 10 yards in a single heartbeat. Jeremiah looked up just in time to see the golden nightmare, claws extended. He didn't have time to scream. She hit him like a falling boulder, her paws crashing into his chest. A single efficient bite to the throat silenced Jeremiah's greed forever. The mob, seeing their leader executed with such brutal finality, shattered. They dropped their torches and fled, screaming. Elara and Matthew stood motionless. Their allies had been faster, wilder, and infinitely more efficient. The mother jaguar stepped away from Jeremiah's body, sat, and began to indifferently lick a paw. The battle was over in less than a minute. The silence that fell was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and blood. "Inside, son," Elara whispered, her voice firm. "Take your brothers and sister to the back room. Don't let them look." She stayed on the terrace as darkness swallowed the two bodies. This was the price of her paradise. This was the cost of safety. The luxury of water and life had demanded a sacrifice. At dawn, Elara and Matthew performed the heaviest task of their lives. They dragged the bodies to a dry ravine far from the spring and buried them. They were burying the past, the betrayal, and the fear. When they returned, Elara spent hours scrubbing Jeremiah's blood from the earth with the pure water from her spring, as if trying to wash the sin away with the miracle. Weeks later, Jacinto returned. The survivors, he reported, had told a story not of jaguars, but of hell. Of golden demons appearing from nowhere, of a water witch who laughed as her beasts executed men. Elara's reputation was no longer that of an outcast. It was a supernatural force. The attack and its dark irony had granted her absolute permanent freedom. Jeremiah, in trying to steal her water, had guaranteed her peace. The Oasis flourished, an untouchable kingdom. The old mother jaguar, the one who sealed the pact, eventually disappeared into the wild to die, but the pact was transferred to her children, who continued to guard the valley. Sophia, who had been the bridge, became the ambassador, speaking a language of calm respect that the new generations of jaguars understood. Brooke, the child of the spring, eventually married Jacinto, uniting the cabin with the outside world in peace, not greed. The land Jeremiah had despised became the cradle of a prosperity his lineage would never know. Elara died an old woman in her own bed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last sounds the constant, gentle flow of the spring running through her home and the distant, protective purr of a young jaguar watching from the rocks. The cabin, the place nobody wanted, became a sanctuary, a legend of a mother who, when cast into hell, had the courage to look the beast in the eye, see another mother, and build a paradise from the ruins. If this story of resilience and unexpected alliances touched your heart, subscribe to Broken Rings for more.